Hey there, boils and ghouls. I really want to give you guys a look into what is essentially my greatest life passion. I am a writer, first and foremost. It's something that I really do want to share more on this channel. And since my book, Poor Pretty Creature, just came out, I thought that this was a good opportunity to talk to you more about my writing process and just my life as a writer a little bit more. I am definitely going to be talking about the book, but if you haven't read it, then don't worry. I'm not going to be including any spoilers or talking about anything that I think might go over your head. Really, my goal here is just to kind of track what my process of writing, specifically Poor Pretty Creature, was. And then on top of that, talking a little bit about the process of getting it published. I just thought that these might be details that to any young writer just starting out or someone who doesn't really know how to get their foot in the door, this could be at least something that you could take some tips from. Not every writer works the same way, obviously. We all have our own creative processes, and I know that my own are definitely unique compared to other writers that I've met. But that being said, there still could be some little tidbit of information somewhere in what I'm saying. I don't know. My intention today is really to just chill with you guys and talk about something that I'm extremely passionate about. This is like my life. Like, this is everything to me. Everything that I do goes back to writing, so I do want to share it more, I guess. I've been a very private person when it comes to writing for a very long time because I do think there's this part in my brain that's always gonna be a little bit worried about what people think, but you know what? It doesn't matter. I'm going on a tangent now. So let's not waste any more time and just get straight into talking about what it was that got me started on writing this book here, Poor Pretty Creature. How did it come from just being an idea in my head to being this book that you physically see? It's pretty thin. So the idea for Poor Pretty Creature first really came to me about 6 years ago when I was about 20. I was still in college at the time, and that very much did affect the way that this book turned out. For instance, I have to admit that the idea came to me when I was sitting in a class on fairy tales. We were doing this whole unit on Bluebeard, which, if you're unfamiliar with the Bluebeard story, this young maiden is forced to marry this older lord who's known to have had a few wives before her. And at first everything seems okay, but there is this one door that he warns her away from entering. And of course she does, and upon doing so, she finds the dismembered corpses of his ex-wives. There are actually so many interesting adaptations of the Bluebeard story if you want to check them out. Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber was definitely a huge inspiration when I was coming up with the idea for Poor Pretty Creature. But on top of that, I also took a lot of influence from Margaret Atwood's Bluebeard's Egg. The thing that really drew me to that version of the story was that it really wasn't a direct adaptation of the Bluebeard story. Instead of a young maiden, you get more of your typical suburban middle-class wife type. The theme of secrecy is still there, but it's more in the terms of cheating or infidelity or issues in their relationship. It's not necessarily, in the Margaret Atwood story, a physical door that she can't enter. It's more this concept of secrets and there being this idea that she can't possibly broach. In this very early stage of me coming up with this idea, I was very intrigued by Bluebeard and it as this gothic story that centered very much on secrecy. And if we're gonna enter into this whole gothic theme, then I also started to think about other gothic literature. There was a period of my life where I very seriously thought that I was going to go into academia just forever to talk about gothic literature. And it just kind of didn't pan out that way. But my point is, that's how serious about gothic literature I kind of tend to be. And just because I loved the gothic genre so much, and I was really immersing myself in it in order to kind of enhance this idea that I was slowly coming up with in my mind, it just eventually got to a point where I wanted to write Poor Pretty Creature almost as a love letter to my love of just gothic. I wanted the castles, I wanted the young maiden in distress, I wanted the villain, I wanted everything. I just wanted to write a gothic story, but I didn't want to do, the conventional thing. I'm always trying to do some sort of weird twist on it, like that Margaret Atwood story where it's not gonna be the direct adaptation. It's going to be something inspired by, it's gonna take the themes. That's really what I was striving for with Poor Pretty Creature in the beginning. Reading through a lot of Gothic literature, I started to get really attached to the figure of the vampire, and I knew that in some shape, way, or form, I was going to wind up including vampires in the story. I was also thinking very much of vampires as this metaphor for outsiders almost. One theme in vampire literature that comes up time and time again is definitely this theme of queerness, so that was something that I personally wanted to expand on more in my version of vampires. When I was writing the book, I did identify as bisexual. For the record, I now identify as pansexual and non-binary, but that's neither here nor there because that doesn't affect how I was writing it at the time unless it was in a subconscious way. The main character, Lucy, is bisexual, and she very much mirrors what my experience with my bisexuality was at the time. Not to go into too much detail or anything like that, but once I get into the actual writing process and it starts getting more into the details, I do tend to write very autobiographically, but in a way that I hide it behind a very thick layer of metaphor a lot of the time. The queer themes are not that way. The queer themes are just me writing autobiographically. It's just a direct translation of my thoughts at the time into Lucy's head. That being said, I don't think that Lucy is 100% the exact same person as me. I think that when I was writing Lucy at the time, I kind of viewed her more as a surrogate of what I wanted to be. Hey, I'm just cutting in and editing because I don't really think that I explained this point well enough the first time around. So what I think I meant when I said that Lucy is what I wanted to be, I mean that I had a lot of, for lack of a better word, angst at the time. A lot of anger, a lot of depression, a lot of feelings that I was working through on account of a lot of factors in my life. And Lucy became the vehicle through which I vented a lot of the time. I don't necessarily mean that she was an idealized version of myself, so much as she was the version of me that was brave enough to be able to say the things that I would never be able to say. Okay, sorry for the interruption. Back to the video. Idealized characters are boring. Honestly, I'm the sort of writer that when I receive the feedback that my characters are mildly annoying, the only response that I ask is that a problem? Like, I want my characters to be annoying. They should be. People are annoying. People have their flaws and their tendencies and their selfish moments. You need to have those in every character. It's just, I know that feels like just such a obvious thing to say in some way when you're approaching writing a character, and it's even it's a very vague suggestion because I can't really tell you what flaw to give your character. The only advice that I could really give as far as that goes is maybe really look at your own flaws or look at the flaws of people around you. Become very familiar with them. That's really the only way that you're going to be able to put them into characters realistically, I guess. Writing does involve a lot of thought and soul searching, even outside of the actual process of sitting down and putting the words on paper. At least that's my experience. As I said, every writer has their own thing, and every writer works in their own genre. If you're going to be working in genre fiction and you just kind of want to write fluffy pulp whatever, then cool, you can be as formulaic as you want because that's what you're aiming for. That's cool. That's great. Full support. I'm just saying that this is my writing process and this is the way that I tend to think about things. Lucy, she needed to not be in the right sometimes, and she needed to even have moments where she could be a little bit villainous, but always with that strength and a human notion, something that brings you back to her. Love is a very easy one to do for that. It's very easy to make people care about a character because they care about something. I could give you all the boring details about like the actual physical writing process. I could tell you that when I write, I typically write up about 3 or 4 drafts on paper, usually, because I just like to write on paper better. That's just a personal thing. I'm not even really going to go into detail about that because it doesn't matter. You're going to find your own way to write that works best for you. If that means paper, if that means computer, if that means typewriter, it doesn't matter. But that's just what I tend to do, is I'll write up about 3 or 4 drafts on paper, and then once I've done that and I'm pretty satisfied with the book, at that point I'll type it up and then I'll read it back at least once, more likely twice, before I then start writing up a query letter. And here we are getting into the nitty-gritty of the not fun writing process. If you want to know more about the publication process, this is where we're getting into that. And now keep in mind that I can't speak for every publication process because there's just so many options for publishing a book nowadays. You can self-publish extremely easily, or you could go through either a publishing house or an agent, but both of those are gonna require a query letter. I'm not gonna go into detail in this video about how to write one. If that's something that you guys really want, I can do that in the future if you really want it. That is a step towards the publication process, and if you want to get published through a publishing house or an agent, it's a very important step that you do need to focus on. Having a good query letter it's your first line of defense. It's the thing that the publisher or agent is going to read before they even read your manuscript. So it needs to be enticing. It needs to catch their attention. It needs to make them realize why this book is important. After finishing up the query letter for Poor Pretty Creature, I sent it out to a couple of agents and publishers, but to be perfectly honest, I gave up on it a lot quicker than I've given up on the books that I'm currently trying to get published. And the reason for that is not because I thought it was a bad book or anything. I'm still proud of this book. But the reason why I gave up on getting it published so fast was because I felt at the time that it was maybe a little bit too personal. As much as I say that Lucy isn't me specifically, I do think that I used her to filter a lot of very raw thoughts a lot of the time. Her character has a tendency to go on these internal monologues that were very much my own internal monologues at the time. I don't know if it was an uncomfortableness with putting those thoughts out there or what it was, but I just felt like this book drew very much from a lot of things in my life that I was dealing with pretty heavily still. A lot of my depression was talked about pretty heavily through this book. A lot of my issues with loneliness, because I had recently, only 2 years ago, I guess, moved to a new city, and I had yet to make any friends, and I was so lost, and I really didn't know what I was doing, so a lot of that ended up going into Poor Pretty Creature. But ultimately what ended up happening was that my mom became aware of this publishing house, Bolero Bird, and she suggested to me that I send in something to them just to see what would happen, basically. At the time, the only completed novel that I had was Poor Pretty Creature, so even though I felt like it was so personal to me, I still sent it, just, see what would happen. And it ended up getting accepted. So, and at that point, I've just kind of figured cool. The book being so personal, it doesn't bother me as much now because I'm 26 now. I'm much more removed from that place in my life where I felt those feelings so strongly. And at the same time, I'm sort of proud that I was able to put those feelings into this book in such a way that I at least perceived to be so raw and so me. And it literally was to the point that I almost didn't want to show anyone this book. But then I just kind of got over that and figured that maybe these emotions that I went through wouldn't be entirely wasted if somebody in a similar situation now can maybe read this book and see themselves in one way or another. So because of that, I really do not regret drawing so heavily on my thoughts at the time, but that is something to be aware of if you're going into writing and you want to share your work. You need to be conscious of how much you're willing to share with people. I'm apparently willing to share a lot. If I wanted to list some works that inspired this book, like some specific ones, if you wanted to check them out, Carmilla's a big one. That one even gets directly referenced in the book. Dracula gets directly referenced as well, but I think that Carmilla was more of an influence on me when I was writing. I also was reading Interview with the Vampire quite a bit when I was writing it, and I know that some influence from that slipped in at some point. I did ask you guys in my last tarot reading if you had any questions about Poor Pretty Creature, and this is the perfect time to bring that up, I guess. Our question comes from Anthropomantic Fiend, who asks why I decided to start the story where I did, with Lucy being chained in a bed. They also asked if I outline my story before writing or dive in head first, which I realize is much more pertinent to this video. I just didn't bring it up because I thought that I had addressed it already, but upon editing I realized that I more or less just hinted at this. If you couldn't already tell, I'm a planner. A lot of writers like to dive in head first, but personally I find that I do that, I get lost very quickly. When I come up with an idea for a story, I like to do a lot of research. I like to seek out books with similar themes and subject matter and moods to what I'm trying to do. When I come up with an idea for a book, I'm really trying to immerse myself completely in that world while I'm writing. And personally, I just find it easier to do that with a lot of preparation beforehand. Anyway, back to Lucy being chained in a bed. The story starts out with Lucy waking up chained to a bed with no memory of the night before and no real understanding of why she's here, the details of which slowly get filled in over time. As much as you really can't tell all that much, Bluebeard was a huge influence in the starting of this idea that eventually became Poor Pretty Creature. And the theme of Bluebeard that I think I wanted to play on the most was this captivity. It's not really a highlighted feature in the Bluebeard story, but there is a certain level of captivity to the young maiden's situation in that story. She does go to Bluebeard with consent to some extent, but at the same time, she's actually a child in a lot of the versions, like in Angela Carter's version, for example. This is an arranged marriage between a child and an older man, and she's forced into this gothic castle full of secrets. And I didn't directly translate any of that. It was just those feelings of captivity, of not knowing if you were safe, that I think I just really wanted to play on. I think that a lot of it did probably come from me overthinking the situation of girls like the maiden from Bluebeard, who find themselves in these marriages but without consent at the same time. They're not there because they want to be, necessarily. They're there because their circumstance, their society, their everything outside of them has forced them to be in that situation. So I was trying to do that in a more modern sense, but also in a much more violent, direct sense. That's really what inspired that opening anyway. If I could leave you with one piece of advice from this video, you need to read. You need to be aware of what's out there. You need to know all the tropes so that you can then turn them on their head and make them completely new. Or, you know, just make your character wake up in a room that she doesn't recognize, like the beginning of every horror movie ever. But that's not, it's a small cliche, I swear. I think that I've probably talked a lot about writing today. If you do want to know anything more about the writing process, about Poor Pretty Creature, about the publishing process, anything at all, do feel free to ask. I love receiving comments from you guys. Anyway, thank you for joining me here today, and I will see you all next time. Although donating to my Patreon is unnecessary, it is hugely appreciated. As little as $3 a month could help me put out many more videos. On that note, I'd like to thank Wilson L. Ricks III, Scott Falks, Andre K, and Thrill House. Thank you so much for your support. It means the world to me.
I can't wait to see you all next time.